So at the beginning of this last panel, of this last segment of the conference, it is perhaps appropriate to return to the initial idea of the whole project, the idea of the so-called triple knot of the current crisis. On the first level, the interconnection of the three fundamental dimensions of the current crisis, the economic, the political, and the ecological, can be seen as a simple fact that in the last few years has been widely acknowledged, even by mainstream conservative authors. When one, for instance, speaks of anthropogenic, human-caused climate change, one should, in this view, in fact, be speaking of capitalism-caused climate change. Global warming, climate change, and all the other ecological issues are generated by the very same capitalism that, on the one hand, produced the financial meltdown and subsequent economic crisis, and that, on the other hand, by its very nature, generates a highly dysfunctional political environment that, in turn, is completely incapable of finding solutions to ever graver imbalances in the biosphere and the climate system. So, in an abstract sense, this seems to be the whole story and a quite precise account, I would say, of our present situation. In this sense, what we are dealing with is not a multitude of crises, but in fact one single crisis, a crisis of the only politico-economic system that actually exists in this world, capitalism. The idea of the knot would then be nothing but a simple, yet a definite representation of the true nature of the crisis. However, on another level, the triple knot of economic, political, and ecological crisis stands, I would say, for strictly conceptual interconnection. And for that reason, it is necessary to count them as three separate dimensions. Not simply in order to represent reality, but to find a way to intervene into reality. In this perspective, then, it is plausible to expect that each of the three dimensions would manifest more clearly one or more fundamental feature of the concept, one or more fundamental aspect of the concept of crisis, that in the other two dimensions still manages to remain concealed, or better, disavowed. Hence, the theoretical task would be, first, to extract this feature in its pure form, and secondly, to apply this feature to the other two dimensions, thereby accessing what is otherwise hidden. So, focusing on the economic crisis, to put it bluntly, reminded us of the fact that crisis of a certain system is nothing but a crisis of a certain system. No more, no less. So the economic crisis reminded us of the fact that crisis as such has no intrinsic potential to abolish the system in which and for which it has occurred. Has no intrinsic potential to bring us outside the system, to make an essential systemic shift. There is, in short, something essential in the banal fact that after the current crisis, we remained in capitalism. Namely, that crisis is a strict inner systemic event. Secondly, focusing on the political dimension of the current crisis revealed the way how remaining in the same economic system is not a product of a simple automatism. Focusing on the political dimension as the sphere of the discourse on crisis revealed the concrete mechanism by which the system is able to somehow persist even after it has reached its end point. And thirdly, focusing on the ecological crisis, as I will show in the second part of this short talk, and what I'm sure will be upgraded, so to say, in the discussion, revealed the irreversibility proper, the proper sense of this concept. In short, the three figures of one crisis enable us to recognize the inner dynamics of the whole system we live in, the dynamic relation between persistence and irreversibility of somehow moving forward. So, whereas the economic and ecological crisis stand for persistence and irreversibility, respectively, the political crisis functions as the mediator between the two. So, it's been long since mainstream politics has been reduced to an instrument of global capitalism, and this has become so obvious that the whole political sphere started to be considered as having no function at all. Making an argument for what seemed to be a perfectly functional economic system wasn't a very difficult task. And the more people believed in the end of history, the more economy was treated as completely autonomous. However, at the outset of the current crisis, the political sphere had to adapt to modified circumstances. It had to find a way to defend a system that was impossible to defend directly. What the politicians then did is they picked the very flaw of the system and used it as an instrument not to recognize it as such, that is as the flaw. In other words, the declaration of crisis became a defense against the logical consequences of its occurrence. I would argue that by doing this, the politicians have triggered a process that is by itself irreversible, for it has dire indirect consequences that go beyond the inappropriate dealing with the economic crisis. Instrumentalization of the crisis, that is the phrase we used in the project, so the strategy in which critics of the system were supposed to be silenced by the crisis itself, is namely a strategy logically, I would say, so absurd that it cannot simply be undone after the job has been done. It is so absurd that it cannot be undone even if the economic system, by some strange coincidence, would manage to completely recover. In other words, a price had to be paid for what at first seemed to be a nasty, but nevertheless smart and subjectively controlled strategy. The very politicians that were keen to do anything only to be given a promise of an imminent way out of crisis got stuck in it. It is only in the field of crisis that the otherwise absurd mental gymnastics found a pseudo-rationality. Or to put it in a more elevated language, at the beginning of the crisis, some kind of intellectual sin has been committed. And it is this sin that still compels, obliges all those who took part in it to stay within a space they have created. Therefore, it came as no surprise that at the very moment when Europe started declaring the end of the economic crisis, the politicians all across Europe grabbed the very first opportunity to find a new crisis, namely the refugee crisis. When this sort of discursive automatism transformed the refugee problem into a crisis, this problem gained not only a new name, but also new criteria, whereby it was fundamentally redefined as a phenomenon. The refugee problem, I would say, transformed into a crisis, is not complex only because it is actually complex, but because it became such. It was transformed into a complex problem. Insofar as from the very start, European politics countered it with its artificial double, namely the absurdly small numbers of a still acceptable amount of the refugees, absurdly small numbers that were supposed to realistically assess how big of a problem is still acceptable and can be, in a way, controlled by crisis management. I think it is precisely this maneuver that is the origin of the paradoxical status of the refugee problem transformed into the refugee crisis. It is at the same time over and underrated, overblown and reduced to the level of a mere operative problem that does require great efforts and is most burdensome, but is at the same time denied the right or possibility of transforming our everyday systemic reality. In this situation, the otherwise self-evident fact that the moment the world we disavow, namely the world that we don't live in, but kind of is part of our global situation, at the moment the world we disavow, or part of the world we disavow, appears in our reality, we have to concede to at least a minimal adaptation of our everyday life was written off in advance. The basic scheme ran thusly: we can accept refugees, but only in a way that will preserve the entire European society completely intact. And I think all further discussions that emerged in this period as autonomous considerations of the differences, for instance, in culture, civilization, and values between them and us, were in a dynamical sense only a consequence of this initial decision. There is clearly no doubt that the problem of refugees is most complex, but instead of starting to think about how to shape the future situation to lessen the problem as a problem, instead of Europe looking for a solution that would be larger, in a sense, than a problem, it decided to present the problem in its initial form already, and this is crucial, as overwhelming. So, as a refugee crisis, with all the implications of the term. Let's recall, the main objective of EU politics during the economic crisis was and still is fiscal consolidation. That is a solution of the problem that was transformed from a consequence, what it is, to the cause of the crisis. So if we achieve the fiscal consolidation, that would mean that we will abolish the very cause of the crisis. So no crisis will ever happen again. Okay, but if the refugee crisis is part of a political crisis, in a way, nothing but another version of the political crisis, if the refugee crisis is part of the discourse of austerity, we would expect the refugee problem to appear directly, so as an unexpected and most unwelcome expense. But is this really the case? Does the refugee crisis really make us wonder about expenses? Are expenses that which generated systemic xenophobia? Are politicians concerned about budgetary constraints every time a euro is spent for taking care of the refugees? Not at all, I would say. What transformed the refugee crisis into a crisis worthy of this name, what transformed the guardians of the budget into the guardians of the border, was not austerity itself or concern about the deferment of fiscal consolidation, but rather the application of the formula of austerity. Namely, the formula that goes like this: as we all know, we can't spend more than we earn, we can't spend more than we take in. But while the guardian of the budget defines when the money bag is empty, as if being indebted was something foreign to economy, the guardian of the border defines when country is in a way full, as a hotel. So we can't spend more than we take in is thus transformed into we can't take in more refugees than we can shelter, as the Romanian and Slovenian Prime Minister, for instance, explicitly stated. It was precisely, I would say, this new formula, which in September 2015 in Slovenia limited the acceptable number of refugees to a few hundred. It was precisely this new simple formula that gave the newly established anti-refugee groups its basic rational foundation. The xenophobic panic, which should have sounded absurd, was thus translated into a rational fearfulness that started to think. Think Europe, German hegemony, global shifts and problems of integration policies, etc. And then started suggesting concrete solutions, building the wall being the main goal, of course. Upon the arrival of refugees, a xenophobic collective would also have formed, I would say, without the connection with the formula of the crisis, or formula of austerity. But the group that did form, the group whose initial cell joined both the classic xenophobia and the much more ambivalent protest against the condition of European politics, the group that actually transcended the usual political divisions could only have arisen in this connection. If the European centrist politics had formulated a different message from the outset, if in its bizarre transparency it had not released to the public the absurdly low upper limits, it of course would not have been able to avoid the reaction of the extreme right. But as it is, it enabled it to trigger a universal restructuring of the political field. Okay, I'm quite sure that at least a part of the centrist politicians would hope that this restructuring could be in a way undone, ungeschehen gemacht. However, it is far more likely that an irreversible sequence has been triggered that will last for some time, to say the least. Now, to get to the point, it is precisely this opposition between irreversibility and the faith in the possibility of undoing, of ungeschehen machen, that is at the core of the third dimension of crisis, the ecological crisis. Okay, only a few decades ago, the field of ecological critique was dominated by the view according to which the negative human influence could be reduced to individual cases and types of interventions, and consequently that acting for nature could be brought down to positive counteracting, to the effort of preventing these individual interventions. Yet the systemic processes which science confronts us with today pose an entirely new situation. Global systemic change that is a consequence of the normal functioning of the system. This is what Henrik wrote about using the distinction, using the kind of a version of the distinction that Slavoj Žižek has this between subjective and objective violence. So what we have to deal with are the consequences of the normal functioning of the system, and not some I don't know, individual extreme actions against nature. According to the old paradigm, the harmful intervention in nature, in the ecological critique, was to some extent, I would say, justifiably understood as something isolated and reversible. However, the new type of ecological threats, where human action often causes partly invisible, yet generally irreversible processes with unpredictable outcome, contradict the spontaneous vision of the world according to which man is considered both an omnipotent master of nature and at the same time as agency that cannot essentially influence nature and which precisely cannot produce a significant systemic change in nature. What we count on actually is the eternal immunity of nature to human interventions. Of course, the belief in the general immunity of nature is not absolute. For instance, most people accept the explanation according to which the increased frequency and intensity of extreme meteorological events, of extreme weather events, is a direct consequence of human actions. We understand that these events result from our interventions. In principle, we also accept the idea that these events will additionally intensify, but nevertheless we spontaneously conceive of them as extremes, after which the initial cured, so to say, neutral state will return or re-establish itself, and consequently erase all the causes of these extreme and catastrophic natural phenomena, all the previous causes, all the historic causes. In other words, we believe that the self-regulation of natural systems will abolish the consequences of past and present human interventions. In short, even if we accept the thesis of the harmful systemic consequences of our actions, every manifestation of the instability of the system continues to be understood according to the old paradigm, as an isolated and unique event, after which the system will somehow return to a stable state. It is crucial that we understand the consequences of our actions in their entire scope, or better, we need to understand that the consequences of human actions can be thought from two perspectives. In the first one, which has already been mentioned, these consequences manifest in the form of particular, isolated, extreme events. However, the actual manifestation of the effects in question is not these extreme events, but the very trend of systemic adaptation to itself, so to say. The truly irreversible dimension which negates the illusion of simply abolishing the negative influences as they emerge does not pertain to the resulting changes, but to the process of change. As already indicated, some consequences of human interventions in nature can already be observed directly. Changes in the functioning of certain ecosystems, the fragmentation of habitats, the extinction of certain animal and plant species, the increase in extreme meteorological phenomena, but also the less spectacular disappearance of the differences between seasons in certain climate types. All these phenomena are in principle accessible to our direct perception and are only secondarily subject to the mechanism of denial, using the other positive events that is the usual strategy of denialism, that every time that snows in America, they say, look, there's no global warming because it snows. So this is negates all the fires and blah blah. But the full reality of the crisis concerns not only the directly visible negative effects in reality, but also another category of phenomena, those which can be described in the strict sense as phenomena with delayed realization. Hence, phenomena that have paradoxically already happened in the future and which as such demand an entirely different ethical stance. An apparently impossible project of preventing the already happened futures. So, what is the main obstacle to motivate people to do something about it? What is the main reason for the general indifference? As I see it, the main reason for the indifferent attitude is actually the very indifference, if we understand it in the right sense. Indifference is, in my view, not a simple absence of positive motivation, but a very firm, only partly unconscious decision. Indifference not only signals the direct absence of motivation, but is also a subjective position that results from a systemic problem of what we called systemic demotivation in the project, not this one, but the European project, Biomat. Indifferent subjective position is not at all neutral, but strictly inert. Merely stating the reasons for action can influence it only indirectly. Indifference, to conclude, is a compromise formation which delegates the solution and responsibility to the supposedly autonomous system and its presumed capacity to self-regulate. This delegation is expressed both in the belief that the natural system is grounded in a homeostatic principle, as well as in the economic belief in the omnipotence of the market's self-regulation. The contemporary credo of demotivated subjects could thus be presented in the following way. I have all the reasons to act for nature, I have all the reasons to do everything to prevent ecological catastrophe. I have all the reasons to act for nature, however, there is nothing I can do. So the best thing is for me to do nothing and let the system take care of itself. Okay, this is the end of the first part, and we will go directly to our two additional speakers, Luko Omladič and Henrik Jøkerjem Bjerrejem, the part of the Danish collective. So, who would like to start? Is there?
Both of us would like
Both of you?
to start.
Okay, so we'll
Okay.
start with
Thank
with you.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to participate in this debate. I mean, of course, I think it's extremely important, and I would even claim to some degree the central issue of the discussion of crisis. What I've been working with is mostly to sort of see ecological crisis in sort of a direct continuation, more or less in terms with what you said, I think, as a crisis of capitalism, in line with Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapelot's investigation of the transformation of the spirits of capitalism. They investigated how capitalism has transformed its spirit from the beginning, so you cannot talk about the spirit or the ideology of capitalism even in the same sense now that you could just 30, 40 years ago, and of course not on Marx's time. They would claim that there have been already two major transformations of the spirit of capitalism, at least in France, in the Western world, resulting from two kinds of critique, especially what they call social critique, which sort of created the transformation to sort of a 20th century welfare state logic, adopting a lot of the criticism from social critique and transforming capitalism in the sense that it absorbed this critique and thereby castrated it, so to say. Something similar with the crisis in the 60s, 70s, from what they call artistic critique about alienation and monotony and work life and so on, but also some forms of ecological critique about inauthentic lives and unhealthy food products and degrading of the natural environment and so on. And then Chiapelot herself actually just 3 years ago published an article which agreed with me, and I'm very happy for that. I'm not precisely sure it was because of me, but that there is a new crisis already and which is coming up, which is the ecological crisis, which will require from capitalism, if it should survive, another transformation entirely of its spirit. And that is, I think, what is at the issue also, what I think Heiko was referring to yesterday as greenwashing, is sort of the solution that is now offered, that the corporate social responsibility is becoming corporate environmental responsibility also, and that we need responsible companies, investment plans, and so on. And this, I think, is the first kind of response, which is a first kind of answer to your question about indifference, that given that we know all this, how come that we're not doing anything? I think maybe even the most important answer to that is that we are already doing something, that this is sort of the common ideology. This is what greenwashing means in a way, that we are already taking care of it. We are changing our business ethics, so to say, in order to deal with it. So there's a kind of partly there's one perception of the crisis is that we are already absorbing, including the environmental critique, into the very logic of capitalism itself. And partly, I think another thing is related to the second transformation of capitalism, the spirit of capitalism that Chiapelot and Boltanski identified from the 60s, 70s, and the artistic critique until today in contemporary capitalism, that precisely incorporated that in the second round the critique about monotony and alienation and so on into the heart of capitalism itself. So today you are precisely supposed to, in your work life, in the business life and so on, to realize yourself as a person, to engage directly with people, to only do things that are immensely important to you emotionally and spiritually and so on. So we have this creative or cultural capitalism, and as it's called today. And in this last transformation, I think the initial sort of beginnings of the current environmental movement was also sort of privatized or turned into a super-ego kind of thinking, individualized, like you also said, that it's individual agents that are responsible for environmental damage, and it's not some kind of global political critique that should be posed to solve these questions. So in that way, sort of the collective political answer to the crisis of capitalism in sense of the ecological issues was repressed simply and turned into super-ego functions. And then we got the political consumer and so on. That I like to use the example of France's nuclear test bombing in the Pacific Ocean in '95, where a lot of consumers all over Europe were pouring French wine to the gutter because we were protesting against France's violence against the ecosystem. So what did they do instead? They bought Australian wine, which was imported then and flown from Australia to Europe to satisfy ethical consumers. So I think you could phrase this even in Bertolt Brecht's terms, that so what is the violence of nuking a coral reef in the Pacific Ocean against the violence of importing Australian wine instead of French wine? So I agree with this, of course, this identification of a unity of these forms of crisis, and that the basic core of this is to be analyzed and critiqued and challenged is capitalism, and that to understand the ramification of ecological crisis now we need to do it in terms of this concept of objective violence. I think is very useful, but also that I think in addition to or somehow differentiating a little bit, I think, from Slavoj Žižek's use of the concept of objective violence, I like to sort of use Michel Serres' concept of objective violence, because it's curious, he actually uses the same concept in his book on the natural contract, where he talks about a violence against the object or the objective as such in a very straightforward materialist sense. So in his framing, objective violence means that we are acting violently against the objective preconditions for our own material existence. So it's not just that it's systemic violence in the sense that there's a capitalist system and then we have unemployment and so on in Greece, but it is even a kind of violence against the object itself. And this, I think, relates, or the objective itself, this relates then to, I think, another distinction which I think is very important to keep in mind from Michel Serres, or observation, that the question is not whether climate change is man-made or not, because, I mean, that is an abstraction of the problematic at issue. What he says in his books on statues is that the physis is merging with the nomos, or the nomos opposite nomos is merging with physis. So the human activities, the human life, laws, regulations, behavior and so on is merging with natural laws, with natural life, so to say, which means that climate change is not something that can be unequivocally linked back to certain specific human actions. Or you could answer the question, is it really man-made or not? Even phrasing that question like this presupposes a kind of dichotomy that in a way actually makes it easy to say, no, it's not, if by man-made you mean entirely with only one causal link caused by human action, which is a way of diverting our attention from the very real problem. And this, I think, also relates then to another question about the future and like you talked about. So how to make people react to a certain kind of reality that is prognosed by natural science that will happen in 50 years or 100 years and so on. One is that, again, that there is no, of course there are some concepts of what is called tipping points, that, for instance, if the Gulf Stream is made so weak that there's no more any exchange of water between northern and southern part of the globe, then we can actually have sort of really dramatic scenarios like in the film The Day After Tomorrow, where suddenly New York freezes to ice overnight almost. So that, and there are questions about methane gas coming out of the great Russian steppes or taiga now, which can cause an immense acceleration of the problems very fast. That's true, but I think one of the ways of addressing this problem you shouldn't accept sort of the blackmail of is it man-made or not, you should also not accept the blackmail that there's a certain point in the future where we might reach a 2-degree increase or 5-degree increase, and then the water level will be so and so. or not. And then we can debate whether that will happen or not. I think what the attention should be is that this future is already here. I mean, it is literally already now. Climate change is completely real in any kind of whatever form you want, like early Lacanian, late Lacanian, or positivist scientific sense. Climate change is completely real, and it is causing very real effects exactly now as we speak. And that relates, I think, also to the issue about the refugee crisis, for example. The refugee crisis should definitely also be seen in light of the climate crisis, because what is happening with climate crisis already now is that we have droughts, we have degrading natural environments, we have depletion of marine life and so on. That is in relation to resources like water, for example, especially causing people to migrate and escape and so on. That's a very important and real part of the crisis that's already happening. So this, I think, is extremely important to be aware of, that it's not some kind of, first of all, futuristic scenario, and secondly, that it's not a question of whether man has caused something that will maybe happen. It is a mixture of man and nature, and it's happening already now. And I thought about, when you mentioned the refugee crisis, that there's also something about, it just occurred to me, the metaphors that have been used a lot to describe this crisis, that maybe there's some kind of displacement simply here, that everybody all over the world, I think, we're talking about a stream of refugees and a flooding of Europe. So in a way it's true, actually, literally, that Europe is being flooded by changes in the environment and in the climate, not by refugees, but they are sort of the human component or element of this. So again, the point would be to, like Zizek said recently, that you should zoom out and see the whole perspective, not just the humanitarian problem in the crisis. And then that relates again to his concept of objective violence, global capitalism and wars and so on. But I think you should maybe even zoom even wider out and see that there's an objective violence in Michel Serres' sense that is going on simultaneously, and which is a fundamentally important part of this humanitarian refugee crisis that's going on now. So then just, I don't know, I'm not sure where I'm...
No, go ahead. Yeah.
But just at least one more observation, I think, is that, so with this analysis of Shia Pelous especially, what she's saying now is that there's something particular about this new crisis that is facing capitalism, or that is inherent to capitalism, is that it is much more open-ended than the previous forms of crisis and the previous forms of critique. I would say probably because it precisely relates to the natural environment, to the objective in Michel Serres' sense, and not to human relations, if you will. So the answer to the ecological crisis is much more open-ended than the answer to the artistic or the social crisis or the social forms of critique earlier. So what she is, I think, warning is that so we have at least 3 or 4 different possible outcomes of this crisis. The first is the greenwashing, green capitalism, which is probably the most likely and probably the least responsible, so to say. I mean, that is going to be a way of, like I said, pretending that we are dealing with the problems without dealing with them. I mean, we had a nice example again from our local narcissistic perspective in Denmark. Our Minister of Climate and the Prime Minister were recently presenting in I think in Brussels, the Minister and the Prime Minister in Obama's but in the press conference in the US, that Obama was praising us for being world leading in windmills, especially at sea, and we were gladly receiving all the praise for this. While literally the next day, the minister on the area said that the government decided to cancel about 1 billion euro worth of investment that was already planned to make new sea windmill parks. So we actually directly, openly pretend that we are doing something about it, and it seems like it's not even a contradiction that we are simultaneously not doing. So, but I think this green capitalism, greenwashing is maybe the most likely, or maybe another version is what she says that, Schiapello says that ecological critique could also well merge with what she calls conservative critique, which is a more elaborate concept in Schiapello than in their work earlier, which relates to a moral, religious critique of capitalism that says that greed is the cause of financial crisis and inauthentic lives relate to a lack of values in a deep sense and so on. And the conservative criticism could easily merge with ecological criticism also. And before I just came here, I noticed that Putin has now, maybe you've seen it, made a public statement that Russia will be the world leading producer of non-GMO food products. So fighting against I think he really says against the capitalist interest of Monsanto and others and so on. Russia will now produce ecologically clean, as they call it, food for the supply the world market. Putin, I think, is a very real first example maybe of something that could be this combination of conservative criticism moving maybe even in the direction of a sort of outright form of fascism as a response, merging of this with the ecological criticism. And then what I think Schiapello would want, and I would certainly think is our task, is to think about the combination of not the artistic critique, which is mostly critique of capitalism about this inauthentic and so on, which is in environmental concerns means something like the political consumer, healthy food, and so on, which is very much centered about individual consumption. But with social critique in the sense of a transformation of certain fundamental economical structures, simply. So the merging of social critique and ecological critique, I would say, that is really the task at hand, which of course relates completely to what you said. But even here you can find two different, at least, roads, I think, which you can find in Schiapello also, that one is the more anarchist in their terms solution that we need more local consumption, we need or production and consumption, we need vegetable produced just outside of the city, then transported on bicycles by local farmers and sold by cooperatives in the city, not using plastic to pack it and so on. That's one possible way. And the other one is social critique combined with ecological critique in sort of collective interventions on the level of state or supranational initiatives, sort of creating large-scale investments and, of course, regulation and taxing on pollution and so on, and also on international level, not only making formal agreements on reduction to get below 2 degrees increase and so on, but making some form of political structure and decision-making that can actually reinforce collectively binding decisions that will simply force local governments to adjust and to change economical structures. And I think this is maybe also how the topic from last evening about collective thinking is maybe connected to this, that I know that, I know from good sources even that Center for Wild Analysis once said that sort of what is their political message, it's something like the very idea of collectivity as such, that working in a collective means that collective thinking is needed, and the thought of collectivity as such is in crisis and needs to be reinvented. And I think you could maybe even translate this very concretely into the formation of a kind of collectivity that is, it's not that violently new, of course, but some form of global citizenship that is extremely concretely related to measures against climate crisis. There's I think maybe it's enough for. Okay,
because just a short question. would you go with the two possible statements? Statements. One is ecological movement can, in a way, only be red. That is like so green can only be red. Or would you go with this, the obverse one, that socialism can only be green? So is green can only be red, or red can only be green? So where to? The question is the field of ecology the one which can offer us a trigger for a political revolution?
I think I would say that green can be red or any other color. That is more or less Schiapello's dimension. But maybe I would say that red doesn't have necessarily to be green either, but then it will only be for a limited time, so to say.
Okay, before I give a word to Luka, I would only like to show, in the case of the Henrik's point that things are already going on right now, is I will take a very one of the most catastrophic scenarios, and then I'll show you the facts from the time right now. So there is this thing was published, I don't know, a few months ago. This was by James Hansen, and can I make it larger? No. Whole screen. Yeah. Okay. So this first row is this is 2065, 2080, 2096, and this first row is actually a model done by IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that doesn't take into account the melting of the Antarctic and Arctic ice. And the first one is the second one is the model that takes into account only the ice melt in North Atlantic. The second one only ice melt in Southern Ocean, and the third one ice melt in both hemispheres. And you get, as you can see, a totally different result regarding the temperatures in 2096, for instance. This is what is almost black. This is, I think, over 5 degrees, right? Yeah, over 5 degrees. This is over 4 degrees and mean temperatures. But so his point is that this is what and there is another point in this. So, okay, if we get this one, this is the last one is the scenario of the film Henrik has mentioned. So it implies that, okay, the catastrophic events will occur in this meantime, but at the end things will kind of stabilize. So we are done with global warming, at least. And this is the end scene in this movie, Day After Tomorrow. But his point, the other, this I think, yeah. So this is the temperatures in other. This line is again IPCC report model, right? And this red one is the one that I was showing below. And this is the temperature in 2096, but in 20 years, the temperatures would rise up again, because after the effect of the melted ice has gone away, the temperatures go back to their course. And here he makes the point that what we should focus on is not really the temperatures, but the global energy imbalance, that this would be kind of the right scientific answer to be that takes into account also the melting of the ice. Okay, but if we take another look, we can see that there is this cold blob, as you call it. And this is the annual mean surface temperature anomaly in degrees Celsius in 2012, 13, 14, and 15. And you can clearly see in these pictures that this catastrophic scenario has some ground in the observation of today. The 2012 was 7th warmest, blah, 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 but you get this like a creation of this blob only in what is this, 4 years, right? Because it corresponds to the melting of the ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Okay, that would be, and this is, so the things are going on right now. This is the period of record anomalies, and you can see this at top 15, and only two, I think, there's only February 1998. All the 14 others are from the last 2 years, if I can see correctly. So this is the anomaly of 1.23 degrees Celsius a year temperature, and the goal in the Paris Agreement is actually 1.5 degrees in, I don't recall, in 2080 or 2100? It doesn't actually matter. Okay, like this is the danger. So the moment that this Paris Agreement was written was actually the moment when, and here is another, and this is the last one. This is a spiral of rising of the temperature. This is 1.5 degrees, and there is an animation I could show you, but I don't think the internet works. But this last line is 2016, this January, February, March, and December. One can clearly see that there is a quite strange things are going on right now, and in a very strange manner. So,
can I just add one thing to that, because I didn't really say that concretely in the beginning about this Bertolt Brecht example about what is the nuking of a coral reef against transporting wine from Australia. The point is also, I mean, and I think it should be in this completely abstract general sense that it is causing this, and maybe sort of the numbers and figures is the right way to show it.
Yeah.
But I mean, the images that we have seen already recently also is that, for instance, the Great Barrier Reef has almost been completely bleached in very large areas. So, I mean, at least you can show that to the children in the school. And that is a result of transporting the wine. So.
Yeah.
And sorry.
Yeah, that's my remark would be that's one of the great philosophical or epistemological dilemmas about thinking of climate change and the impact it has on this indifference phenomenon. And I'm not sure. I completely agree with you that the climate change, the basic nature of climate change is a process that you can experience directly. It is happening, of course, but I think the true difficult epistemic nature of climate change is that it is an object that is, in a way, constructed by science. Even though it's happening now, you can fully understand it as a climate change only if you understand it as a scientific object, and scientific, in a way, scientific and statistical abstraction. So this is one of the difficult points of the climate change.
And Mike Holm, he said that the whole problem talking about this is that climate doesn't exist.
Yeah,
weather exists.
They say they always say this little joke. The climate scientists that the climate is what you expect, the weather is what you get. So it's this complex object, and in a way, this is one of the reasons it's so difficult to confront the indifference we are seeing. For example, This is one of the comics from Mladina, how to represent the global warming. It's called global warming, and this would be my second remark. The question of imagining the climate, the environmental crisis in general, or climate crisis in particular. We have this image of polar bear standing on his, clinging on the last iceberg, that should invoke some emotional response in a way, as one strategy. And then I think there is another strategy which shows to be more effective. It's the one that you showed us. The strategy which uses abstract tools like graphs and the numbers and the charts, and somehow they work better than the image of polar bear. Maybe it's precisely because of the nature of climate change, as a epistemic nature of climate change. In a Hegelian way, you have to have this abstract concrete to have a really effective.
Yeah, but I think that you actually need this short-term changes. For this strategy to be effective, and I think this is already too late then. Yeah. So when they start to show in reality, from 2015 to 2016, then the problem is already much too large.
Yes,
yeah?
you need to connect at the end, and this is the question of activism in the end. If you want to connect you need to connect the abstract reality of climate change as a scientific explanation with some kind of real experience that the people across the world are experiencing right now. We know that the temperature in India was over 50 degrees Celsius in last month, and now it's even worse because the wet season has come. So, and the third part of this triad is the image of the future. Which can be either very catastrophic, but the catastrophic images of the future tend to act as sometimes as something that takes the weight of the problem out of the problem. So Hollywood catastrophe films. So sometimes it's even better it's more effective to imagine the catastrophic future with more abstract images, like, for example, this one, which shows Italian coast in the near future, in a possible near future. This is not just it's a scenario on 6 feet. That's 2 meters rise of this sea level, which is by Jim Henson's projections extremely possible in the next couple of decades.
That would be if the model wasn't radical enough. Right?
It's not really one of the most radical models, and this could happen by the end of this century. And it's not just the Venice that disappears.
But Slovenia remains okay.
It's the Veneto. It's the Veneto that disappears. So it's not really. Yeah. It's Slovenia. Slovenia has a luck with its coastline, but still. I mean, it's a bad joke, but on the other hand, of course, none of the countries will be accepted from the consequences, one way and another. And I think one of the aspects that are not mentioned very often is that this deep destabilization of societies that could happen with the deterioration of environment. Is happening in the world where there are still many countries with the large supplies of nuclear weapons or nuclear weapon capabilities. So we kind of forget this type of crisis that was popular in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but it's still very real and still very here with us. And in a deeply destabilized world, this could be one of the main dangers for a future of mankind. Okay, so my second remark would be on material and political, economical aspects of the climate crisis. And again, if we use a graph, I would use this one. The source is the annual Greenpeace report on the energy, global energy, and here we see that the fossil fuels, which are of course the main cause of the climate change, is the principle, the main mean of production in a modern industrial economy. It is the energy from the fossil fuels that drives the whole production, and so the whole extremely intensive energy flow of our modern industrial world is the result of the use of the fossil fuels. So it's almost all, and this is the state of the art now. It's 80% of almost 80% of all energy produced in the world is from fossil fuel sources. And even for this, the rest of the 20%, there is only 10% of these are modern renewables, and the other 9% are renewables, but this is the traditional renewables, that to say wood that they chop in Africa to use in the kitchens, which is in the end it's even less sustainable than fossil fuels. So what we see here is actually the proof that the transition to post-carbon or carbon-free society is not only the matter of technical transition as such, it's the matter of the profound change of production mode. And the question is if this change of production mode can happen within the structures, confines of capitalism. And I think the answer has to be no. The green capitalism is impossible as such. This transition is not possible within the modes of capitalist production. Again, there's a large theme of in Marxist ecology thought. In a way, Marx himself has famously recognized ecological crisis of capitalism when he spoke of Stoffwechsel, that is metabolism, metabolic rift in the processes of exchange of matter between nature and man as a condition and a consequence of capitalism. So Marx said that the capitalism produces conditions that provoke irreparable rift in the independent processes of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. The result of this is squandering of the vitality of the soil, which is carried by trade far beyond the bounds of a single country. So it's this metabolic rift of capitalism is something that is also global by definition. And these deep contradictions in a carbon economy are such that the green capitalism, I mean, it have to be argumented much more in a precise way, but such that the green capitalism in the end, it's not possible. My last remark would be on political and political moral consequences of of a climate change, so kind of superstructure on the material side. There is of course a question of global justice, and this question of global justice is in the center of public debate because the whole world is clinging to these international accords like Kyoto Agreement or Paris Agreement as our last chance to stop catastrophic environmental changes. And of course, the key point in this negotiation is the question of justice, the question that the countries that will be most affected by climate change, at least in the midterm, are also the countries least responsible for the cause of climate change. And then usually this is represented by this type of graphics. For example, this is the famous graphic. It's called carbon map. You can see the animation on the internet. This is the actual area, surface area of the world, and then the map transforms to show different aspects of distribution. This is distribution of wealth, and then the carbon emissions, as we see that Africa and South America shrink considerably, and it's even more obvious when we take into account historical emissions.
Which are the one that actually count, right?
Which are the one that should count from.
But not from a perspective of justice, but from perspective of science.
From physical, from both, from perspective of justice and from the physical point of view. So that's and the consequences. So the vulnerability is general vulnerability. The number of people at risk from the consequences of climate change, and more specific, the ones that are open to the risks of sea level rise and poverty caused by the climate change. This is the mechanism that the environmental science knows very well, that the vulnerability is a function of wealth of society, usually. Like the earthquake, the same earthquake in Haiti would cause much more damage, much more damage, much more suffering than the earthquake in New Zealand, for example. But the point is, and I want to connect this with Davide's presentation, his critique of Rawlsian theory. There is an inherent Rawlsian solution in a type of thinking that the climate accords propose. So this type of Rawlsian solution is that we need some kind of fair redistribution of wealth. So we have, for example, Paris Agreement that defines how much carbon budget each country has, and the other part of the Paris Agreement is the redistributive part. When you say, okay, it's fair that the rich countries redirect some of the funds to poor countries. But it's all based on the concept of fairness, on the concept of distributive justice redistribution. And the other concept, which is much more radical, and for example, Naomi Klein is one of his more proponents in the last years, is a concept of climate debt. So the climate debt is something very different than just a redistribution of wealth based on fairness. Climate debt means that the countries have certain claim to these funds. In the same way as we recognize the financial debt as a result of certain activities in the past, the proponents of climate debt say that we should recognize these historical emissions as a result of a past extraction of carbon and so on. And the countries that did this have legitimate claims for compensation. And this is something very different than the fair redistribution of wealth that these climate agreements propose now. Again, I spoke with a couple of times. I spoke with the negotiators in this climate agreements, and they always tell you that when the climate debt, even when the word debt is mentioned in the draft documents, it gets cancelled immediately. The eagle eye of the European negotiators are there, and at the moment that somebody writes, even as a proposal, the word debt in the context of climate agreements, it's completely forbidden. But this is probably the way for more radical and for more just, if I may use this word anyway.
I'll give a word to Henrik just to
it's very,
just and then we'll take some questions perhaps from the audience. Or,
yeah, of course, it's very shortly. I just thought of, first of all, I agreed with this, of course, completely, that climate doesn't exist. And that's my whole point, in a way, is not to end up in these abstract categorizations, man-made or not man-made, future or now, and so on. But, I just thought about, in this discussion, you mentioned that I thought of an old Russian joke from the 90s, because as it was well known in the time of Russian Revolution and up till Stalin, at least, there was this discussion about whether it's possible to imagine socialism within the frames of one nation alone. And then with the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the extreme crisis and corruption and so on in the 90s, and the simultaneous rise of religious thinking and so on, then the new question that occurred was, is it possible to imagine Armageddon in one nation alone? But I think this is relating to this, that again we should not think about, like you also said, about the catastrophic, like one big scenario that the whole earth will disappear or vanish or be destroyed or something. But it's possible to, and that's the whole idea of the concept of objective violence in both forms that we've talked about, I think, is that objective violence in any sense exactly creates local disasters. Again, the whole idea about that nature will die and so on. Like Bruno Latour said, that nature should die. I mean, we will get rid of nature as this kind of unified idea of something that can live or die.
One strategy is one that, for example, this Naomi Klein and her movement follows in the later years. So let's just say her criticism and her background is also a kind of anti-capitalist left, and she was, as she says, at first skeptical to climate change movements as a part of a bourgeois green thing. But later, and that's her strategy now, or this movement that she kind of represents, is that you can somehow connect the activism on the ground, the activism against the processes that directly deteriorate your environment. For example, like fracking in the United States. Or destroying the forests of the Indians in Canada for tar sands and so on, that you can directly connect these grassroots movements against deterioration of your environment with the general drive against the climate change. So that's one possible strategy. which goes in a bit different way than the one I agree we proposed here. And the movement, which is a bit connected with that, is a Leave It in the Ground movement that also kind of tries to connect with the individual experience. But at the end, I think we cannot avoid the fact that the climate change is that kind of epistemic object that, yeah, as I said, requires a different type of ethics or even ethos to stimulate you to act.
A different kind of problem. Yeah. From economic crisis solutions, political solutions.
Yeah.
Okay.
But just very concretely, I mean, without opening this discussion about our transportation again, but I really honestly and I think it's extremely simple in principle, and then there's a lot of details, but it should be prohibited to fly as it is right now for certain purposes. And we could, I mean, and then we could introduce some frameworks of justice and so on, that if you have above a certain level of income, maybe it should really be prohibited, and if you have lower, if you are from the southern region and so on, you can fly to a certain extent and so on. I'm really completely for this, and I think this is one of, I mean, if it is serious that there are some problems and we have to introduce certain new measures, we should make an international binding agreement that it's illegal to take an airplane, or we should, it is completely absurd and vulgar, I think, that you can fly to Ljubljani from Denmark and pay less than driving in a car or going by train and so on. It's almost impossible now to go by train, and for that, to change that, you need strong collective organizations for making decisions that are reinforceable. That's a nice example for what that would mean, I think.
Yeah, because I think that the number is that the emissions of plane traffic actually equals the emissions of France and of UK and Germany combined. So this is not, it's not a funny problem, I would say, right? Because it's it's not at all banal. But I get it somehow. Your reaction is, I think, is at least symptomatic as well. So at least, yeah. And you always get this kind of response when you talk about it. But I think you can, perhaps each has to find his own interest in this. I mean, if people are, if my interest maybe is not directly, because I don't think a lot about the future and blah blah, but my interest would be that it would be possible, let's say in a public sphere, to show this graph and 90% of people would get it. So that would be my interest in this. So to abolish this total stupidity and love of stupidity that is going on. So if we conceive to that people are not, smart enough to get these simple graphs, then we are in deep shit, right? So.
The Marx concept of metabolic rift is very useful in this respect. As I cited, the metabolic rift is what is universal, and then this metabolic rift is somehow distributed. It's not the wealth difference as such that is distributed, but the metabolic rift itself is what is basically redistributed across the world, and after that it produces all kinds of effects. Bellamy, I'm here with the Bellamy Foster's interpretation, of course, yeah.
I think we need to look at the plot categories we use much more closely to specific social, economic, ecological quality. We're talking about what is that wealth. The problem, there's a problem in the future, but it is of course a question of the distribution to labor. What are the use of opportunities to live? But in the future, the question of distribution of wealth will become increasingly relevant if we
Maybe just
it's substance. It's
yeah. This can be a politically sensitive question in a way. I can just give you an example. I'm working with an international group that prepares a kind of ethical background for declaration on for UNESCO declaration, future UNESCO declaration on ethics of climate change, and for example, there was a vivid discussion with our members from Asia, and they had this. They proposed that the whole ethics of climate change should rely very much on the concept of frugality. The word itself was kind of new to me in this concept, but apparently it comes from. It has its context within the Asian philosophy and so on. So frugality as a different approach to what welfare, well-being, or wealth itself is in a different cultural contexts. But again, this is a thing that can be politically sensitive, because in a context of international climate negotiations, the wealth is universalized. You cannot say to the Chinese, well, maybe you don't need this kind of wealth or this kind of well-being that the Europeans have. So I think it's a kind of open question. I don't really. I cannot answer you satisfyingly in this moment. So. But it has at least two aspects, and they're both politically and ethically sensitive.
I mean, a way of answering this article that you referred to, I tried to sort of make some kind of scheme of the agents behind the various crises in Boltanski and Schiapello's terms, that the social critique is sort of articulated by and on behalf of the mass of people. It's a class problem, that there's exploitation and so on. While the artistic critique is very much articulated by and on behalf of the ego, sort of the need to lead interesting lives, to have self-realization, fulfillment in life, and so on. So that has certain individualistic, liberalist sort of implications almost by nature. But the ecological critique is open-ended, maybe precisely because it is, and I have used sort of the Norwegian deep ecologist Arne Næss to articulate the agent on behalf, by whom or on behalf of which this critique is articulating itself as the ecological self in Arne Næss's terms, which means something like in all humanity's relations to the objective in Michel Serres' sense, that we are directly linked to everything, that our lungs are the plants and so on. So we are in a directly interaction with everything, and it's this dimension that is now articulating its critique, so to say. But that dimension is precisely so universal and so vague that it doesn't have any other than some kind of Michel Serres and some kind of global solution of love and solidarity, and and that ends up sometimes in hugging the trees and defending rights of ants to cross the road and so on. And so in that sense, and there's been a lot of critique of this potentially even fascist tendency in, for instance, the deep ecology movement, which I think is a real concern. So that's why I think it is extremely important to articulate this kind of criticism, ecological criticism, in forms that are directly related to the social critique in Schiapello's.
When my interpretation why the Paris Agreement succeeded because it was a couple of years ago, after the Copenhagen, it was quite viable that the whole process of climate negotiations will fall apart. Well, my interpretation is precisely what you said, that the politicians, the power, the rulers of the world, so-called, I think they finally understand that the matter of the whole environmental problem and climate change problem has become a matter of national security and national interest. So, in a way, the translation has happened from the language of green, ecological, concerned, and so on, to this purely realistic, in terms of international relations, realistic language of power, which they understand and they speak. And that's one of the reasons why this Paris Accord happened at all, because it is in their mind now a question of national security and national interest, without a doubt, and it is actually. So it's horrible in a way, but in the other way, it's also the reason why we have this accord at all. But the question is how effective it is. That's
Yeah, but I think this image when it was announced, when they all stood up and applauded, this was really a show. They really did something for their national securities, but they presented it to the public as some kind of like the declaration of end of all wars and blah blah, like the United Nations we wish for. I think this was it was really a bizarre image. So
this was the panel point of no return, and now we reach the real point of no return, which means that our conference is approaching its end. I would like to thank all of you for participating in this event. I think it was fun as we intended. It was very productive. And I will again thank all foreign guests for coming here, presenting us their ideas and views on the topics, thought-provoking ideas, and the audience for their attention and participating in the debate. So we reached the point of no return. Thank you.